here we're just, this is just the playbook that we're going to go through, and I'm going to run this in Ansible automation platform, and we'll run it in a couple different ways so we can see kind of like the end result, and then we can kind of dig into it with verbosity a bit to see how it worked. And this is where the repo is, where this playbook actually is. So if you click into this, I'll give you the PDF, afterwards when I post the recording on the Meetup site and also on the YouTube page. You'll be able to get to this link and have access to this playbook and modify it if you'd like. So let me bring up, and I probably have to grab my password real quick. This is just to one of our temporary pods, lab pods. And we'll walk through the playbook as well. So the one that I want is, they all have brown field in this particular section, so I'll just find the one that we care about, which is check ports. So the way that this is working is I have 4 routers that are in these lab pods, but they're routers. So what I want to do is use a switch. So the easiest thing for me to do was use the Cisco's always on Nexus. And that's what I'm pointing it to. So what I do need to make sure before I do this is that it still has a configuration set for those ports. So let me go into the repo real quick, and I just want to go into the README file so I can paste in some things just to kind of create the baseline for the configuration. And also I need the password for the Nexus, so I'll grab that real quick. Probably gonna need to make this a little bit bigger for you. Hopefully you can see that okay. And that won't log in, but at least I have my password right here so I can copy it. And back to here. So I just want to put a couple VLANs in there, and I want to configure some of them for trunking using the native VLAN of 199 for the trunk native VLAN. And I also want to configure some port security configurations, which port security is something that you cannot access from a resource module. And the reason for that is not every configuration has full parity in resource modules yet. So there's always those, one-off types of things where, from a configuration perspective, we'll use like the config module in Ansible, in this case for Nexus. And we can either use a Jinja 2 template to configure those things or the lines parameter under config. And to use the Jinja 2, you also use the config module, and then you use the source, and then it'll read in your Jinja 2 configuration and apply it, that template to the device. So in this case, we're just going to go ahead and paste it in here on this side. And one of the important parts too was the turning on port security. That may not be on by default. And that's a Nexus switch type of thing, config. All right, so now we have a config in here. So when I run my playbook, then it'll be based, off of that config so we can search for it. This is a little too big now, so there we go. And back to check ports. So I'm running it the first time without any verbosity. So we're just going to see like the outputs. And hopefully it works, since I made some changes to some other stuff earlier today. And then I'll explain the output after it finishes. If you have a question, also just unmute yourself because I can't really see the chat while I'm sharing this screen. All right, so here's some outputs, and we'll, from this, we'll go ahead and drill in a bit to understand like how it worked. So the first part of this is I wanted to list out um, different interfaces depending on their description. So I have the host name from the inventory, and Cisco calls that router Nexus OS. So if I had more than one of them, right, we could just keep iterating through. And but we only have the one and the always on. So the Nexus OS, and then the one target that we're matching on is the description is trunk port. So on 16, 18, 112, and 114 and 124, they're configured as trunk ports with that description, right? So we may not trust that just because the description's there, there may be other configurations missing. And I could also combine more of these together, but I kind of wanted to keep it bifurcated for now so that we can kind of walk through the differences of how it looks on the playbook. So the second one is basically the same thing, but we want to look at access ports. So 17, 19, 111, 115, and 125 are access ports. And as we move down, here's where we're just looking at descriptions. So what we needed here was the Ansible network resource module facts for interfaces, because that's where descriptions live. So we evaluated that to figure out, what their descriptions were, and that was all, structured data. So it was pretty easy. And then the second thing that we wanted to do is, I mentioned earlier that I wanted to list out my trunk ports, but not just all my trunk ports, just the ones that have a native VLAN that matches with VLAN 199. So that's the same as the ones that I put in there with the description of trunk port, right? It matches up 16, 18, 112, 114, and 124. So that was kind of like the second validation, was to see, the native VLAN 199. And then the third thing that we wanted was to look at the access switch port access mode interfaces that were configured for VLAN 101. So that's the ones that I pasted in as well. When we look at their configuration in totality, it's different all the time. So you'll see like a bunch of different VLANs in there and other interfaces, configured for different things. So we're really just matching on just specific ones based off of the attributes, that we put into our filters. And then the last part here is a little bit different, because here we were dealing with this structured data that was already in memory because we gathered it through the network facts. But I mentioned, not everything is available in those facts, because not every, possible configuration is available in a resource module. So when we run into those situations, we can still use our show commands, and we can pipe and filter them just like we do from the, normally do from the command line, and get it as close as possible. But then we can, further evaluate it, and we can use these same principles with the non-structured data. So with having said that, you can see that I'm iterating through like all these ports. So these are the ports that that are a part of that existing configuration, but we're looking for just the ones that have the port security configurations. So from that, these are the ones that were listed out that have port security configured. So this was just a nice way of listing out, matching on different configurations and having an output. But like to kind of see how the sausage was made, it is a little bit different for each one of these. So we'll go ahead and we'll drill into that a bit. So what I want to do now is I'm going to run this in verbosity so you can see what we don't see here is like when we're going through some of these tests, you just see the okay that it passed, but you don't see because of the verbosity, you're not seeing the actual JSON. So I'm going to turn that on. So when we run it this time, you can see like how our select adder and mapping, and other techniques that we used in filters, we're able to parse through that data and then ultimately, locate off of conditionals, what we were trying to match on. So for me to change that, I just go into details here and find this job template and then edit it. And we'll turn on verbosity to 1, so it's not too crazy on the output. It'll give us the structured data. That's all we care about. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and launch it again this time. there's always that possibility that someone may come in and change one of my ports, but it's highly unlikely. But I mean, it could happen. So we'll see that every time you run this, you're kind of validating again. So here's all the data. This time we can see that from each task. So the first one is the interfaces resources. So we did interfaces in layer 2 interfaces. So that's what all this is, right? So you can see how it's pulling in descriptions, and it's also pulling in, all of those interfaces that from a layer 2 perspective that were either configured as, trunks or access ports, everything as it were in that device. So we don't really have to understand what ports were already there. It's going to go through and pull all of it in. And even, the ones that are in there, like this VLAN 100, we didn't really do anything with. So those are other configs that coexisted with the ones that we were matching on. And then when we set these description filters, that's where I'm using a set fact. And we're further refining this data because we're using the select attributes in the mapping. So let me bring up the playbook. So the playbook is in here. Check ports. And I'll kind of move this over to the left. And then, well, I guess since I'm sharing a window, is that going to screw things up? I might have to toggle, so it'll be a little bit easier so I don't have to share differently. So I'll just make this big again. So we've got our output is over here, and our repos over here. So we'll just walk through this playbook real quick. So again, we already talked about this part on the slide. All I care about is interfaces and layer 2 interfaces. And then what I can do is set fact. So set fact, that parameter allows me to create my own facts, right? So these are really useful, especially if we're gleaning information and then we want to further refine it and then create a new variable that we can use for either like displaying information or copying that content to a file, those types of things. In this particular example, what we're doing is we've got the Ansible facts, right? And as we further parse into that, we're looking at the network underscore resources interfaces. And then within those interfaces, we're matching on any of the ones that have a description defined. So that's kind of the first step. And then in the second step, I was looking for two different things to print out. So the first result was based off of the trunk ports, and the second one was the access ports. So as we go through that data, we have the equal to conditional. So the first one, it has to be, the description needs to be trunk port, and the second one needs to be access port. And then ultimately, the mapping is what we saw on the screen that was printed out because we just wanted the name, which the name, when we look at an interface resource module, is the name of the interface. So going back to here and looking at this, then you can see, and it's easier if I click into it. As we look at it, it looks a lot nicer. So as we look into here, we can see we have all these descriptions, right? And then some of them are trunk port and some of them are access ports, right? So once we determine, okay, these are the ones that, that contain a description, right? So it's not every interface that's on that particular Nexus switch, right? It's just the ones that had descriptions defined. This is one that we don't care about, right? So we're not going to print that one out. So, but that one does have a description. So since it exists, right? So we list all those out, and then all we care about is printing out the name attribute. We could print out this entire dictionary too, right? So what we're doing is we're just further filtering using the map. So we just want that list of names based off of what we selected. And that's what we got here. So in my debug, I had like the two entries. So that's why we have the two lines here. And then this is a list of what those results were, separated by commas. So if I go back into the playbook, that's what we did here is the host name, right? So it's the Nexus OS, and then we had one entry for each one of those. So that's pretty straightforward, and that's very easy because all we're doing is using equal to, and we're finding, that that particular entry, And then all we care about is just the one attribute that we want to print out. Now the trunk filter is a little bit more complicated because there's more things that we could potentially match on. And what I wanted to do here was utilize the layer 2 interfaces. So that was different facts that came in, but this was a part of that first entry. So when I scroll up to here, the layer 2 is in here. So like we kind of go through interfaces, right? So Ansible network resources interfaces. So we go through this whole dictionary of all those interfaces, and as we work our way down, we have the layer 2 ones here where we start seeing the VLAN stuff. So where's that starting at? Oh, actually, why am I doing it this way? It's easier to look at it like this, right? So here's the layer 2 interfaces. So it's just going through all of these. And some of them have no configuration, some of them have some configuration. It doesn't matter for us, and we care about the ones that are VLAN 101, and also we care about the ones that have trunks with native VLAN 199, and we only want to print out the name. But again, we could print out whatever we want from that particular dictionary and list of items underneath. So if I go back into the playbook here, so we've got our layer 2 interfaces. We know which ones those are. This first one, we want trunk.native VLAN. So we started here at the layer 2 interfaces level, and then we're further, parsing down the path to trunk.native VLAN. And this is all structured data, so we're just following, at the top level of the dictionary, and then trunk.native VLAN, so we're at the native VLAN level, and if it's defined, so it exists, then what we want to do is in the printout, what we're doing is we're further refining it, because we only want native VLAN 199. And we don't want to print out everything. We only want to print out the name of the interface. So we're just mapping to that. The reason why I had these in here, I forgot to take them out, is if I ran this and I hadn't pasted my configuration in yet, it would fail. So I was doing different types of configurations, so I wanted to get past some of these tasks, even though I knew they were going to fail. So this is just here more for like development purposes, but it serves no purpose right now, unless we ran this and we forgot to paste in a config. And if there was nothing in there that we could match on, then we would need to set this up differently to make sure that we have a default omit, that type of thing, so it doesn't stop trying to find this undefined variable. So the next one was access VLANs, which was basically the same thing, right? So access is defined, and then when we're printing it out, we only cared about VLAN 101 and then those interfaces. So this is really very similar, right? Because we're using structured data. This is very straightforward. So matching on that is super easy. Now the Nexus OS, it does give us the ability to have output in JSON. So I kind of could have cheated a bit, but what I wanted to do is make this as close as possible to what it looks like when you're doing the same type of mapping on a catalyst switch. So with catalyst switches, we could use, different types of parsers if we wanted to have structured data output, but we really don't even need to mess with that because we can use this same methodology with unstructured output as well. So what happened here is I'm just doing a show run interface and then interface item, right? So what this is I'm going to iterate through here my interfaces, and each one of my interfaces I want to run this command, and what I'm looking for is this specific port security violation restrict, or switch port security violation restrict configured for that particular interface. So another way of adding like select attributes and mapping. So here it was kind of gone off the screen a little bit, right? So and as an alternative, you can do it this way too, and just use your indentation. So it's basically the same thing. So in this loop, I want the Ansible network resources for layer 2 interfaces that we collected, at the beginning of the playbook. And I just have my pipes, one after the other here. So the select attribute part is the access is defined because our port security is only configured on our access ports. And then we only want to print out the name of the interface. So it'll create that list of just the names of the interfaces. And that's how we set this one up here. So it was like one right after the other listed out. And in our loop, the loop control is just, instead of using the default, which is just item, the placeholder of item, you can name it whatever you like. So that way there's no conflict if you're, running multiple different loops in the same playbook. So I'm just calling it interface underscore item. And then we're registering into memory port security. So as we run through this, this is going into memory, and then I'm creating a fact from that, because this is this first iteration through here is not one of the facts that I'm gathering, directly from Ansible facts. I'm running a show command. So I need to run that show command, and then that response that comes back, I'm registering that into memory, and then I'm creating a fact from that. So in that structure, I named it port security. So the dictionary's named port security, but then it has, it further parses to results. And then within results, we have access to standard output or standard output underscore lines. And that's what I want to do here is I want to get to the standard output. And because I'm not displaying that on the screen, I don't really need the lines. Looks more human readable, and standard output is just like, a blob of output. I'm using the search conditional with select attribute because this is the unstructured data, and I can search for these strings. So in particular, this is the configuration that that we want to see in a port. And if that's not there, then it's not configured for port security. So when I print out down here, that's what I'm going to see is just the interfaces that have this particular configuration. So what this does is it opens it up in a fairly straightforward way, any configuration that I'm trying to glean from a device. If it's not structured data, which I prefer, then I can use the unstructured data, or I could use, other methods like output in JSON in a Nexus, or a parser in like iOS XE, or just doing this because it's pretty straightforward and it's easy to teach people this so they don't have to, understand those other layers of different modules and things that they need to use to make that work. So the bottom one, just to kind of like give you like a double click into that for this one here for the port security, I want to go back into the output and we'll click into there. So scroll down and go into here. All right, so or actually I don't think I went far enough down. Yeah. So there's our output, and go into this one. Well, that's just I need to go one more higher up. This one, that one. Yeah, here's where all the stuff is we're iterating through. So since we're iterating through, each one of these is like the individual interface config, but you can see what it's doing. So we'll go into one of the ones here that actually has the switch port port security configured. So I click into here and look at the output. That's the standard output, but then we can still see in the JSON what we were doing. So basically what we were doing here is we did a select attribute to say, okay, if we find these strings in standard output. So here's the standard output. Here's standard output lines. We could have printed like all of this out, but we only wanted to print out the names. So where the names were down here at interface item maps to the name of the interface. So that's what we map to, so that we are only printing out the interfaces here as a list. But we could have print out like any of that output. And this was just like a single output because we included only the one thing. But we could have looked at like show run interface Ethernet 1.7 and got like all the output, and then we could have matched on like multiple different strings if we wanted to. And that's ultimately what we wound up doing here, is just printing it out. So we've got this list of interfaces. So all of our access interfaces for switch port mode access had VLAN 101, and then ultimately we're looking for port security. So we could have kind of combined this together to have like an output where, however we wanted to structure that, we could have done that or created a file, which we would just use different modules. So if I wanted to incorporate like the Ansible built-in copy, we could have copied like the content out instead of using the debug to print it on the screen. and then we could have created like a file from this, and then used a filter so that way we could do like nice YAML as an example to have that output, or just keep it, like a standard output, or turn it back into JSON. Whatever we wanted to do, we can easily do that. So manipulating data is really easy once you have access to it. It's really the navigating to the data is a challenge.